Greetings, welcome back to another Strike Fighters 2 tutorial. I've gotten some requests for gameplay tutorials, and while I'm not looking to be a tutorial guy, necessarily, I think there are some things that we could go over, and that would maybe help people out. So today, we're going to look at radar displays, RWRs, and missiles. Radars from the 50s, 60s, and 70s are quite different than modern displays. So even if you're familiar with modern avionics, you may not be aware of what information the older set is telling you. We'll begin with the F-4E Phantom, which was equipped with the AN APQ-120, the radar so advanced for its time that it needed a second crew member just to operate. We'll cover this one first, because it gives us the most information and has the most functions of any of the old radars. You'll find that many of the earlier sets work the exact same way and use the same symbols as the F4, so they will be easy to understand once you're familiar with this one. Let's begin by turning on our radar set by pressing the page up key. We see here that the radar powers up in search mode. The radar can be slightly confusing at first because it is essentially showing the airspace in front of the jet as both a top-down view and a head-on view at the same time. The scope has an artificial horizon, target selector brackets, and two moving lines showing the radar's search pattern. The moving vertical line, called the B sweep, shows the radar's azimuth, and the small tick on the right shows the vertical elevation. In the upper right, the current range of the radar is displayed on the instrument panel. The radar's full range is 200 miles, but targets can only be selected up to 50 miles. Let's unpause. Cycle the radar range by pressing the page up key. I do that, and we see that we have a 100-mile range, then 200, then 5, 10, 25, and finally back to 50 miles. Shift page up will cycle the ranges backwards. We can see that in search mode, the F-4's radar searches the sky 120 degrees in front of the plane horizontally, but only 4 degrees vertically. The tick mark on the right shows that the radar scans 2 degrees above the horizon, then 2 degrees below. It's a good idea to pitch up and down periodically to get better vertical coverage and see what's out there. Now we'll cycle the radar modes by pressing the page up key. Boresight mode locks the radar looking dead ahead at a range of 5 miles. Any target within plus or minus 3 degrees of the caged gunsight circle is detected, and the radar will automatically go into acquisition mode to attempt to lock on and track it. This is useful for targeting in the heat of a dogfight when you don't have time to be fiddling with manually targeting an aircraft. Point the nose at an enemy plane and it'll lock up. Next is ground map mode. In this mode, it will display major terrain contours like rivers, oceans, and mountains. It also displays ground targets. The ground radar still has a range out to 200 miles with a minimum of 10. Ground targets cannot be selected on the radar. Some aircraft will also have a terrain avoidance radar to see any terrain in the aircraft's flight path. Now let's see the radar in action. I begin by asking the ground controller for the nearest enemy contact. Pressing the R key will auto-select the target of the most recent radio transmission. Red crown tells me that I have bogeys left at my 8 o'clock at 20 miles and 10,000 feet. That's a good place to start, so I'll turn to point my nose in that general direction and set my radar range to 50 miles to ensure that I pick them up.
Cobra, lead, red crown, bogeys, left 10 o'clock, 25 miles, Angel 20.
As I roll out, we've got 4 clear groups of targets ahead on the scope. I'll back the range down to 25 miles, and now I see that this target is 15 miles ahead of me. I now want to lock this target up, so I start moving the targeting brackets around by pressing the Home key. If I continue to press the Home key, the brackets will cycle between all available contacts on the radar screen. Once I've highlighted the target I want, I press the Insert key to lock on. And now I'm in tracking mode and I've locked onto the target. I have a good strong radar return, so the system locked on very quickly this time. Be aware that depending on many factors like enemy ECM or ground clutter, acquisition time can take much longer, and sometimes blips disappear and then you can't get brackets on them at all. This is normal, and it means that you have to maneuver closer or get a better angle on the target to get a clear radar return. Now, this radar set is telling me a ton of information, so let's break it down. First, the scope is telling me the range to my target. Think of the radar as looking down from above, showing you a top-down view. The top of the scope is whatever radar distance you have selected, in this case, 25 miles. Using the evenly spaced grid lines coming down to the bottom, which would be range 0, we can do some quick math to see how far out each one is. In this case, each grid line is 5 miles out, so it looks here like my target is at 14 miles. We can also tell if the target is moving towards us or away, and how fast. This is called closure rate. The outer ring on the radar scope is called the range rate circle, and the small break in its perimeter is known as the VC gap. The direction this gap is pointing indicates the closure rate of the target. When the gap is at the 12 o'clock position, there is no closure rate, and the target is at a constant distance. As the gap moves clockwise, it means that the target is closing at a faster and faster speed. At the 1 o'clock position, the target is closing at 300 knots. At 2 o'clock, the rate is 600 knots. At 3 o'clock, closure rate is 900 knots. Another way to think of it is that however many degrees the gap is around the circle, add a 0 to get the closure speed. For example, 3 o'clock is 90 degrees around the circle, and therefore closure speed is 900 knots. Also note that on the F-4 radar, the tick marks around the circle indicates every 100 knots of closure rate. Other planes still have the range rate circle, but without tick marks, so it's good to be aware of what the VC gap's general position means by itself. If the gap goes counterclockwise from 12 o'clock, that means that the target is pulling away from you. Again, each tick mark indicates minus 100 knots, up to a maximum of minus 450. It is possible for the VC gap to wind all the way around clockwise to the 9 o'clock position and beyond, which would be indicating more than a 2700 knot closing rate. The radar is now also sending information to the lead computing gun sight on my heads-up display. You can see the thick bar on the right side of the outer circle of the gun sight. This indicates max range for the selected weapon at 12 o'clock, moving down to minimum range at 6 o'clock. The gun sight also has 3 roll tabs to help the pilot maintain attitude awareness. Speaking of selecting weapons, let's see how different weapons will interact with our radar scope. For medium range, we have AIM-7 Sparrows. These particular missiles are E models and have a range of 16 miles. They are semi-active, which means the missile gets targeting information from our aircraft even after it fires. This is known as riding the beam. Because of this, we must keep our nose pointed at the target after launch. Up front, we have AIM-4 Falcons. These are also semi-active and have a range of 6 miles. Outboard, we have short-range AIM-9 Sidewinders. These are infrared homing, meaning that they lock themselves onto the hot exhaust of an aircraft. They are self-guiding once they launch, but the drawback is you can't be sure which target they've locked onto. This could potentially cause friendly fire if launched into a mix of friendly and enemy aircraft. While modern HUDs today will highlight which target the missile is locked onto, there were no such visual aids at this time. Sidewinders have a range of around 3 miles. Finally, the F-4E was fitted with an internal 20mm Vulcan cannon for gunfighting at close ranges of less than 3,000 feet, with an optimal range of 1,700 feet. Even though many of these weapons are still in use today, and may be familiar to you, it's important to remember that this is still the 1960s and 70s. If you expect the performance of modern missiles, then you will be taken badly by surprise. Missiles at this time were less maneuverable, and often failed to track. Sometimes, while trying to launch, seconds would tick by on the rail before they would fire. Missiles at this time didn't have solid-state circuit boards inside. They still used vacuum tube components. Vacuum tubes could be easily broken by vibrations from takeoffs, landings, high-G maneuvers, poor ground handling, stiff breezes, and nearby sneezes. Between that and extreme environments, such as the tropical climate of Vietnam, missiles were incredibly unreliable. Additionally, firing during maneuvers would cause missile failures. Sidewinders, for example, could not be launched in excess of 2 Gs. Pilots would ripple fire, firing multiple missiles at one target, since one or more was sure to fail. Early missiles had been designed to intercept lumbering bombers, and early attempts to shoot down fast fighters proved that the missiles were underpowered and unmaneuverable. AIM-7 Sparrows had only a 10% probability of making a kill, while Sidewinders were only slightly better at 18%. The AIM-4 Falcons, on the other hand, were absolutely atrocious. In 7 years of combat, they only hit targets a grand total of 5 times. As I cycle through my air-to-air weapons, we see some changes on the radar screen. Each missile has an ASE circle and a max and minimum firing range. ASE stands for Allowable Steering Error, and this circle changes size depending on range. The larger the circle, the better the chance to hit. We need to maneuver to place the steering dot within that ASE circle for the missile to have a chance to lock on. The steering dot is the computer-calculated lead ahead of a target so that a missile can intercept it. Now that the radar is locked and is tracking one target, it's also displaying its bearing and elevation constantly. The vertical bar shows its horizontal position, while the elevation tick on the right side will show elevation above or below the nose. Think of the radar now showing you a head-on view of what's in front of you. So as I maneuver into position, bringing the steering dot into the ASE circle, the radar is telling me all sorts of information. My target is directly ahead of me off my nose, straight and level. It's at 13 miles with a 0 closing rate. It's within the range of my Sparrow missile, which is showing as 15 miles on the scope. As a backup, the green in-range light has come on just to the left of the radar. We are in a perfect position to fire. No Gs on the aircraft, level flight. Let's fire that Sparrow. Fox 1. Missile away, and it's tracking. For the duration of its run, we have to keep the steering dot within the circle. The missile is still tracking, but we seem to have a problem. Unable to catch the target, the missile self-destructs. Firing from long range when an enemy is moving away from you means that they can potentially outrun your missile. To counter this, you should be moving as fast as possible when launching a missile. This means that the missile expends less fuel getting up to cruise speed, and can close the gap faster. I've selected full afterburner, and when we look at our closing rate, we see that it's positive now. The range is slightly closer, and we're closing our target at 400 knots. Let's try again. Fox 1. Missile is tracking.
You got a bandit in your 6 o'clock. Gone. Good shoot.
And this time, we hit the target at 6 miles away. Now, on to the next problem with the old radars. We see that we have several targets at close range ahead of us. Let's target the closest one. Do we fire on it? By pressing Ctrl R, I can select whatever is targeted by my radar. Turns out, it's a friendly F-4. Aircraft radars of this time did not have IFFs on board to identify friend or foe. The Navy didn't install IFFs in their fighters until 1966, and even then, it was only 30 aircraft, and they were fairly unreliable. Because of the huge number of friendly aircraft over Vietnam every day, the rules of engagement in that war stated that visual identification had to be made with a target before being fired upon. This, of course, completely negated the beyond visual range advantage that the long-range missiles gave the F-4s. However, if you want to make things easier on yourself in the game, you can simulate having an IFF interrogator by pressing Ctrl R to target your radar lock and see what you've locked onto. Alternately, if you already have a target selected, pressing Shift Insert will auto-select and lock on with the radar. Now we're chasing a MiG-21 with an AIM-4 Falcon. Let's take One more close look at the radar scope as we're preparing to shoot. The range is set to 25 miles. The VC gap shows a closing rate of 900 knots. Radar shows the target at 8 miles, slightly off to the left and above the nose. Firing range for the Falcon is shown at 6 miles, with a minimum somewhere around 1 mile. Let's unpause now and wait for the MiG to come into range. Less than 6 miles now, in range, confirmed by the in-range light. Fox 1. The Falcon is tracking and tries its best, but it's easily outmaneuvered and goes ballistic. We're too close now for another Falcon, so switching to Sidewinder. We hear the infrared growler come on, and the ASE circle is much smaller now. Notice that we're within the Sidewinder's maximum range according to the radar, but the in-range light is not lit. That will only come on for radar-guided missiles. The Sidewinder's head is now seeking a hot target, and when it finds one, the growler will jump up in volume noticeably. There it is, Fox 2. For a solid hit, the old banana in the tailpipe. Notice that after firing the missile, the lock went away. If you ripple fire, you will have to wait for the next missile to acquire its own lock before you launch, otherwise the second missile will just be a dud and go ballistic. Let's see another Sidewinder launch as I have tone on this Su-7. And that Sidewinder malfunctions and arcs down towards the ground. It's a dud. I have to wait for that next lock now, and it's taking a moment to find it. There, I've got tone, firing. Now to getting close for guns. You'll notice I've got the radar on boresight mode. This means that the radar will automatically lock up on any target that passes in front of the nose. When there's no target selected, the gunsight auto-sets to 1,000 yards. But once we lock up on something, it'll start computing the lead on the target. In theory, putting the pipper gently onto the target and firing should score a hit. However, like the missiles, these old targeting computers are very finicky. Tiny control movements will make the reticule move all over the place, and you can end up being led around by the nose by it and never hit anything. So it's important to be incredibly gentle when trying to line up the pipper on the target. Personally, when I play, I prefer to just cage the gun sight straight ahead because I trust my eye instead of this leading sight, but I'm trying to take it very gently here and demonstrate that the system does work sometimes. Here's another run. As we swing around, we can see the attitude dots in action around the gun sight, giving me an artificial horizon. Also watch as the radar locks on, and it displays that range bar in the right half of the sight. I'm watching that range come down quickly now as I dive in on this Sukhoi. Here's a demonstration on how to lock the radar onto a visually selected target. I ask Red Crown for the nearest enemy. I press the R key to select the target that they report. I've now selected the Su-7 right in front of me. I press Shift Insert, and the radar locks right onto that aircraft for me. We're now in an F-8C Crusader to take a look at its much simpler radar system. You'll notice everything looks and works the same, it just offers much less information and has different ranges. This plane doesn't fire radar-guided missiles, so the radar is primarily for searching and for use with the radar-guided gun sight. I've got blips on the radar, so I set 20 miles and select one of the targets. Notice how long the radar stays in acquisition mode this time. Now we jump to an FAE to see the gun sight in action. Notice the rectangular radar screen with slightly more information. The lead computing gun sight still works just like the F-4s, but has a slightly different design. Here, we put only the small circle over the target to hit it, instead of the whole gun sight. I prefer this because it gives me a lead sight, which then I can agree or disagree with, but I always have a fixed gun sight to fall back on at the same time. Now we head back in time even further to the Korean War and this F-3H Demon. You can see it has the same search and bore sight modes that we're now used to at various ranges up to 40 miles. When I lock a target, notice that the closure rate circle appears. There's a steering dot on the scope, but no leading gun sight, so I have to do it the old-fashioned way. First IL-10 is toast. And I put some air-to-air rockets right into the second. Maybe you fancy yourself a gentleman knight of the sky and fly with the RAF. Here we are in an English Electric Lightning. This radar has the same familiar search and bore sight patterns with a range up to 60 miles. You'll notice different range scales pop up on the sides of the scope depending on what range you've selected. The target selector here is a circle instead of brackets, but the function is the same. The squiggle with the dot in it is our range and horizontal position indicator, and we have a simple steering dot. The big difference here is that the closure rate circle now operates backwards from the American version. I have no idea why this would be, but now a counterclockwise gap indicates that you're closing in on the target, and clockwise would mean range is opening. Here, I'm equipped with Fire Streak missiles, which are infrared homing with a range of 5 miles. Notice that there is no audible growl. Instead, look at the gun sight. When a missile is locked on, a small orange square appears to the bottom right.
Red Crown, Rambler East, Aspen Waypoint 4. Rambler 1, Red Crown, copy.
Good hit with Fire Streak. Now I'll close for guns with the radar on bore sight. This aircraft has a much more stable leading gun sight than the F-4. Now maybe you prefer to fly from behind the Iron Curtain instead. Russian radars still work the same way, but they have less features and less range. This was due to the fact that the Soviets went about their business in a different way, so the radars didn't have to do the same job as their Western counterpoints. In Soviet interception doctrine, aircraft were under the strict guidance of ground controllers. They would guide the aircraft right down to the interception, only releasing them when the fighters could take over visually. Since detecting targets was in the hands of ground controllers, a large radar was not needed on the fighter to scan hundreds of miles of airspace. A small, short-range set would suffice for detecting targets within the last 10 miles of an intercept. Here we are in a MiG-17 PF, also known as the Fresco D, and sporting the Izumrud RP-2 radar, which is located in the black humps around the intake. This was the definitive all-weather variant of the MiG-17 and was used for night or bad weather intercepts. The majority of MiG-17s were day fighters. Only 11% of total Frescos built were equipped with any sort of radar. Only 47 of those would be equipped to fire radar-guided missiles. Turning the set on, we have only 2 modes, search and bore sight. The range is fixed at 10 kilometers for both. The vertical scale shows range in kilometers, and the bottom scale shows bearing up to plus or minus 60 degrees from the nose. The yellow bar in the middle is a small artificial horizon. The long green bar appears to indicate radar altitude above the ground. Here we are closing on bombers at 6 miles. They finally appear in my scope at 10.5 kilometers. I can't select or lock any targets manually. I can only use search mode to guide me towards the blips that I see. As I close in, I switch to bore sight to get a lock. There we go, it's in acquisition mode, but look how long it's taking to lock up this time. Once it does lock, we get some more things popping up on the scope. The green light on the top right shows that the set is locked with a target. Target range is represented as a small upside-down T, which will move up and down the range scale. Beginning at the 2 kilometer mark on the range scale, there's a box which represents optimal gun range. And a small steering circle appears to help me lead my shots.
Angel 20, heading southwest. You're clear to engage.
I toast that first pour Canberra, but I'm too close to the rest, so I'm going up and over, repositioning with the barrel roll. The rounds from the guns on this plane are pretty slow and have noticeable bullet drop, and the target is outside the range box on the radar. Firing slightly above the target does the trick, and another Canberra is on its way down.
Showtime, lead, red crown. Mission complete, RTB.
Those were solid hits on the other two, but it looks like I still have to finish them off as they're limping home. There we go, got a hit on the left wing. And it looks like the left engine is on fire. Finally bursts into flames and down he goes. Let's go finish off the last one. This is the MiG-21 PF all-weather interceptor. It's equipped with the RP-21 radar, a much improved descendant of the RP-2 we were just playing with. Range is still fixed, but is now improved to 16 kilometers, or 10 miles.
Dagger, lead, red crown, radar contact.
I've got the game HUD on again so that you can see what's going on more clearly. We're closing on Phantoms. At 10 miles, they barely come onto the scope, very, very faint at the top. Even though they're above us in clear sky, we're getting very weak returns, so it's likely that they have their ECM turned on.
15
With the target locked up, we see the steering dot is an inverted T, which we want to center over the circle on the scope. The radar is also showing us a range blip between max and minimum range markers. We have the IR growl in our ear, but no visual indication to fire. MiG-21s primarily carried infrared short-range missiles, but this variant also allowed them to use radar-guided missiles as well. We move back to the Phantom to now look at RWRs, or Radar Warning Receivers. This is the instrument that gives us a visual and audible warning when we're being tracked on enemy radar. First, the basic setup. On the scope screen, we see sticks of different lengths pointing in the direction of any radar that has picked up our aircraft. Dotted lines are aircraft radars, and solid lines are ground radars. Below that is the panel known as the billboard, and this displays additional information on the types of radars that are hitting the plane. Don't confuse the length of the line with distance. While the RWR does report direction, it's not reporting a distance to any radar, only what mode that radar is in. Any lines touching the smallest ring towards the center of the display are radars that are in search mode. This means the radar can see you, but is taking no action. Lines that flash and reach the outer circle indicate radars have now acquired you. This means that they are following only you and are either directing AAA fire or trying to get a solution to launch SAMs at you. This is accompanied by the rattlesnake or pulsing sound, warning you that you're on the highway to the danger zone here. Finally, lines that reach the outside of the scope and flash at a faster rate indicate that they have a radar lock and missiles are being launched. This will be accompanied by the red launch light and a loud warning tone. Looking at the billboard, the top row of lights would indicate that at least one of the radar beams is a SAM radar painting you. 3 lights denote how strong the signal is. The red launch button lights up if a missile is tracking you. On the row below that, the first light indicates if AAA radars are tracking you, directing anti-aircraft fire in your direction. The second light can indicate AAA radars tracking you, or the low-power gunsight radar of a day fighter. The third light indicates the high-power radar from an all-weather fighter. AI stands for Air Intercept. These lights will give you some idea of what's tracking you and let you decide how to deal with them. Be aware that infrared-guided missiles will give no warnings either visually or audibly. Some aircraft have no visual RWR, but have audio only to warn you of missiles. Some other aircraft, like F-8 Crusaders, didn't have any RWR at all until 1966, when they were hastily installed. Make sure you know what's installed on your plane, because silence may not mean that you're safe. Also remember that the RWR detects all radars, including friendly ones, and doesn't differentiate between friend and foe. Let's unpause and look at the example. Here I have a dozen or so ground radars off to my front left, 2 aircraft radars behind me, and 3 radars that have acquired me. I have a warning pulse in my ear. My billboard tells me that at least one radar is a SAM, and at least one other is a AAA director. As a 4th radar acquires me, I get a new mid-level strength SAM light. More and more radars are acquiring me, indicated by the flashing line touching that outer circle. The AAA light goes out for a moment, then comes back on. It's clear that I've got a mass of SAM radars trying to take a shot at me. There we go, I have a launch at my 9 o'clock, indicated by the long flashing line, the warning tone, and the launch light. The warning tone will continue for a while, even if the missile misses, because the ground radar is still locked onto you. Try to break the lock immediately, because further missiles could be coming up from the same site, or other sites, and you would have no way to know except visually scanning for the missiles. And finally, let's look at one of the first of the next generation of radars and its special abilities. This is the F-14A Tomcat of 1974, equipped with the AN/AWG-9 long-range Doppler radar. The AWG-9 was controlled by an analog computer and was light years ahead of the previous generation of radars. Instead of simply displaying raw radar returns directly to a screen, radars now processed information through the computer, which could then display more complex information. This allowed the radar to now show things like friend or foe, direction of travel, and be able to track multiple targets. The F-14 has a range of up to 400 miles, which is double that of the F-4, and has a minimum range of 25 miles. With the radar in search mode and the gunsight caged, the radar and artificial horizon show navigation information to the next waypoint. Range to waypoint is counting down at the top left, which is less than 35 miles here, with the bearing of 270 displayed to the right. The antenna elevation is on the left side of the display, and now includes an actual number to display the plus or minus degrees of elevation, not just a tick mark. Radar range is in the lower right. As we reach the waypoint, we see the display update with new range and bearing information. Besides search mode, this radar offers a new mode called track while scan for tracking multiple targets. Auto acquisition mode is a fancy name for bore sight mode, but does the same job and is used for close dogfighting. And an air combat mode can visually identify targets from long distances. We'll begin with an AIM-7 Sparrow attack in our familiar search mode to compare it to the older F-4.
12 o'clock, 25 miles, Angel 30.
I have enemies dead ahead at 12 miles. I can see them with no problem on the radar. Using the home key, I select a target with the brackets and lock it with the insert key. I'll switch to a second one. At this point, I'm still only tracking one target at a time, using the full strength of the entire radar on one enemy aircraft. Cycling through my missiles now and selecting my Sparrow, we see a lot of information come up on various screens. Let's take a moment to walk through that now. On the top display, we have a steering cross, though the ASE circle no longer appears. On the left of the screen is our range indicator. The tab on the left side is the range of the target and will move up and down, while the tabs on the right are fixed and represent maximum and minimum missile range. When the target is in missile range, an amber hot trigger light will illuminate above on the instrument panel. The currently selected radar range is displayed below the range line. On the bottom right is the type and number of missiles selected. In this case, SP3 means that I have 3 Sparrows left on board. On the bottom display, range to the target is displayed as a number in the top left as RA. Next to that is the current missile range, also displayed as a number as RM. This is the same information as the range bar in the top display we just looked at. On the left side is the target elevation above the nose of the aircraft, and on the right side is closure rate. There's no more circle or VC gap. The closure rate is now displayed as a positive or negative number. Targets now appear on the scope as one of 3 icons, a half square, a half circle, or a triangle. In the upper right, we see several unknown targets represented by squares. The tails on the contact indicate direction of travel, in this case, towards me and to the left. Once you lock onto a target, your onboard IFF interrogates the contact and displays friend or foe. Towards the bottom are 2 triangles, our 2 enemy bombers that we've already looked at. Friendlies would appear as circular contacts. As I close on the target, watch the range coming down on both the range bar above and in the numbers below. Sparrow range is showing as 13 miles. I'll finally pull the nose up and let's look at the heads-up display. Besides showing us pitch and bank information, notice the scales on the left and right side. On the left is another indication of closure rate. It ranges from minus 200 knots to 1,000 knots, which we're in excess of at the moment. On the right is the third range indication. Radar range is displayed at the top, in this case 25 miles, and the 2 lines indicate max and minimum missile range. The small pointer indicating target range is just above the max range line at the moment. At the bottom center, the HUD tells me the type and number of missiles selected. And in the center, we have a target diamond, showing us visually for the first time where our target is out in front of us. Additionally, the steering cross will also appear here. As I unpause, the target is well within range, so I turn to put the steering cross under my crosshairs, and fire. So far, other than some fancy symbols, exactly the same process as in our earlier jets. Now, let's look at the new features. With the track while scan mode, I can lock up a target with a portion of the radar's power while the rest of the radar still scans the sky. This is possible because aircraft radars are what is known as a phased array. A phased array radar doesn't move or rotate, but instead uses electrical current to electronically move the radar beam. This also means that different parts of the radar dish can be looking in different places at once, although at a loss to radar power. This mode can also be a benefit because tracking a target with reduced radar power may prevent their warning receiver from alerting them to your presence. The downside is that your radar can be more easily disrupted by ECM or other countermeasures, so sometimes it may still be necessary to switch to regular search mode and bring the full power of your radar to bear. Track while scan mode is also how we can assign multiple targets to our AIM-54 Phoenix missiles. Phoenix missiles have their own radar sets and are self-guiding. They just require the F-14 to designate their targets prior to launch. We do this by selecting a target with the brackets, pressing insert button to lock, then switching to the next target and pressing lock again. This can be repeated until every missile on board has a designated target. In this case, I have 4 Phoenixes, so I can designate up to 4 targets. If I target another one after that 4th, it resets missile number 1 to that new target. You can see that missile range is 73 miles, and we are well within that now, so I'll launch all missiles one after another, and they'll be on their way with no more action needed from me. And number 4 failed to track. That's $500,000 down the toilet. But the other 3 are on target. The missiles cruise at high altitude, then drop down onto their targets from above. It should be noted that while Sparrow missiles can be fired from the track while scan mode, they'll only lock up at close range and they cannot be designated with multiple targets. That is a feature of the Phoenix missile only. Missiles can be launched only if the hot trigger light is on. If you're engaging with track while scan mode and the light is not lit, press insert again to make sure that you're locked on. It may be necessary to switch to search mode to get a stronger signal. Engaging with sidewinders is no different than in earlier jets. An audible growl will tell you that you've locked on. Additionally, the hot trigger light will illuminate. These early HUDs do not show which target is locked on by the missile, so you'll still need to be careful about firing towards friendlies. That concludes this in-depth look at radars, radar warning receivers, and missiles of the 50s, 60s, and 70s. I'm sure it still didn't cover everything, but I think I've touched on enough to give you a good base of knowledge. Additionally, if you want more detailed information, I've put a link below to a very informative forum post about the F-4s radar and RWR systems. Another great resource is your Strike Fighters 2 manuals that come with the game. They can be found in your main SF2 folder under Manuals, and they come in a dozen languages. That's going to wrap it up for today. Thanks for watching and happy flying.